Hi, and welcome back. I know it's been a while, and all I can say is I've been busy, and I had almost lost interest in the build as I just didn't have time. But things are looking up, and I'm picking things back up again. Now, in this episode, it's a bit of a strange one, where not much of it's covered in the build manual, and what is covered, I decided not to follow and do things differently. As the title suggests, we'll be doing the Scuttle, which may seem strange as it comes pre-attached to the car. Well, with me being me, I wanted to easily be able to remove the Scuttle, which is a mod most people do after owning the car for some time. But before we get into that, let's go through the build manual.
So on page 108, fitting the handbrake. Parts required are the handbrake assembly, handbrake pulley, handbrake clevis, pulley clevis pin, handbrake clevis pin, handbrake cable. The tools required: two 30mm spanners and a pair of pliers. The tips they provide: remember to put a loop in the inner cable around the pulley. Cable tie the adjuster end of the cable to the tip. Use pliers to bend the legs of the split pins once in place, which then holds them loosely into the clevis pin. Handbrake wire connector goes to the top terminal and ties up. After plugging in connectors, cable tie and secure any excess wiring. On page 109, they give an exploded view of the handbrake. One thing to bear in mind is that this, if you have an S3 chassis, you need to loop the cable. If you've got an S5, you do not loop the handbrake cable. Next, we move on to page 58. Dry sump fitting the expansion bottle. The parts required: expansion bottle cap, expansion bottle bracket, expansion bottle plate. Tools required: a 13 and 11mm socket, 11mm spanner, a drill bit, pop rivet gun, and a marker. The tips they provide: lay the plate over the top of the chassis until the holes sit in the middle of the tubes, mark and drill. Throw away the red end cap that came on the expansion bottle. Page 59 gives you an exploded view of how to install the mounting plate and the expansion bottle. Next, we go to page 66, dry sump catch can. The parts required: all they give is a silicone hose. The tools: 7mm socket, a knife, and some spray. They don't mention what spray. The tips: silicone hose you're looking for has a 90-degree one end and the other end a long piece. The hose itself should have a grey lining. Put hose through P-clip and attach to tank. Use the excess to run from the tank to the D bottle. Page 67 gives you a diagram showing you fitting the hose to the dry sump tank, cutting it, and installing it into the catch can. But there's no mention of how to install the catch can or where to install it, except for the diagram. So with that being said, let's jump into the video and see how we got on. First up is the gear lever installation, which isn't covered in the manual at all. Now, it's pretty straightforward to install. All you need to do is line up the tongue at 12 o'clock with the groove at 12 o'clock and slot it in. Then you need to install the dust cover with the flat section at 12 o'clock as well, and secure in place with the 3 bolts. Next up was the handbrake. After finding the correct parts, the only real bit of assembly is fitting the clevis to the handbrake. Once you've worked out which way around the clevis goes, in the end, I don't think it really matters. I did find there was quite a lot of play between the handbrake and the clevis arm. So I decided to add a few washers to prevent this from rattling when the handbrake was in the off position. Next was to install the handbrake into the car, which is held in place with two M6 bolts. You also need to ensure that the handbrake cable is clipped into the correct retaining clip near the diff. The trickiest part was fitting the pulley to the clevers. Depending on how big your hands are, this may be easier done prior to installing the handbrake into the car. All what was left to do was to fasten the bolts up and ensure that the clevis pin was secure with a split pin, and then connect the handbrake light. When routing the wire around the back of the handbrake, I was concerned that it could get caught in the back of the handbrake ratchet and pinch the wire, so I opted to route it via the front and cable tied it in place. Something to take note of is that the handbrake light needs to come on before the first click, so it's worth checking this prior to fitting the tunnel cover, something I only learnt afterwards. So you would have noticed in the previous episodes that I'd already moved the scuttle, but I never showed you how I did it and why. As you can see, the scuttle is pop riveted to the top half of the firewall, and although you can remove it with it still attached to the firewall, it requires you to first unbolt the fuse box and various other items from the firewall, which I thought would be rather tedious, and I wanted to be able to remove it quickly. So to remove the scuttle, you first need to drill out all the rivets running around the firewall, and then there are two M6 nuts holding it to the chassis on either side behind the kick panels. The car comes without the kick panels installed. These will be installed later on in the build. There is also an additional pop rivet either side which requires drilling out too, although I didn't capture this on camera. When it was time to remove the scuttle, I had a little trouble getting it off, and I initially thought that I hadn't drilled out the pop rivets properly and they were still holding it on. But after a little head scratching, I decided to remove the aero screen, and then I remembered that there were two press studs underneath the aero screen in the middle that were screwed into the top dash hoop. Once they were removed, the scuttle came off quite easily. I would definitely recommend using some gloves when removing it, as some of the edges felt quite sharp. There's meant to be two electrical control boxes velcroed to underneath the scuttle. For some reason, only one of mine had been stuck to the scuttle. The other still had the white backing paper attached to the sticky part. So the main reason for removing the scuttle was because initially I wanted to be able to switch between the aero screen and the windscreen, and to install the relays for the heated seats, and of course to have a look around. I was quite surprised how much wiring was actually used for the 620 dash. One of the other reasons was to relocate the oil catch can and the coolant expansion bottle. The reason being that I'm planning on tracking the car, and the idea of having to remove the nose cone to check the catch can or to empty it is a real pain, and because I've already scratched the car once trying to put the nose cone on, which thankfully Caterham did touch up for me. Now, as you'll know, the manual doesn't cover installing these on the firewall, even though they are mounted here on the race cars. I did look for a manual for the 420 race cars, but couldn't find anything online, so they may only be factory built, I'm not sure. So I had no real dimensions to work with, other than a few pictures I found on the internet. So this was more of a guessing game and what looked about right. And I also wanted the breather to go into the catch can from the top, not like the others I had seen where they've just drilled a large hole in the front of the catch can for the breather to run straight into, which I thought didn't look great and could possibly leak from if the can got too full. So after much test fitting, sticking bits of tape, measuring and checking the coolant tank and airbox had enough space, I was eventually satisfied with the positioning. I was then able to mark and drill the holes. As usual, my trusty GoPro corrupted the file and I didn't capture the footage, but as you can see, I simply pop riveted the bracket in place. Now for the coolant expansion bottle, I needed to work out where the bolts for the heated seats relays were going to be so they wouldn't foul with the bracket of the coolant bottle. Once that was done, it was a simple case of marking the holes and drilling them out. Now in order to mount the relays, you actually need to remove them to be able to access the bolt location, and they needed a little persuasion. To be honest, I could have got away with just removing the outer two relays, but for some reason I decided to move all three. Once that was done, the only other thing to do was to cable tie the wires up. And in the process, I managed to slice my finger so a bit of blue roll was in order. And of course, to connect the heated seats harness to the main loom. And as per usual, this isn't covered in the manual, so I had to hunt around for the appropriate plugs. I'm not sure why I was using a scalpel and not side cutters, so don't ask. One thing to note, if you order your car without a windscreen and only an aero screen, they don't install the washer pipe, nor do you get the washer bottle and the pump. As I wanted to have the option of installing a windscreen, I thought it'd be best to install the washer pipe now, while I still had full access to the tunnel and the rear of the car. Next up was mounting the expansion bottle to the firewall. A quick check to see if the airbox still fits, and I checked off camera that the standard banner battery still fitted too. Caterham leave the last part of the inner panels loose and don't punch the trim holes for you. The easiest way I found was to use a paint pen to mark the holes and then use a regular belt punch to punch the holes out. As I wanted the scuttle easy removable, I didn't want to use pop rivets to secure the scuttle and instead used riv nuts. In order to accept the riv nuts in the firewall, I needed to enlarge the holes to a 6mm and deburr the holes to take the M4 riv nuts. Drilling into the dash hoop was the least favourite part of the whole job, because this was the only part of the chassis that if I wanted to revert the car back to original, I couldn't simply replace. Whereas the firewall was a separate piece of aluminium plate. One thing to point out is that the dash actually has a double hoop, one for the lower part of the dash and another for the upper part of the dash. The lower is first welded to the chassis and then the upper is welded on top of the lower. So I had to drill through the side of the upper hoop and also into the lower hoop for the riv nut to fit. And then another quick cleanup so the powder coating doesn't get scratched. I think I've done the most vacuum ever during this build, and I would highly recommend getting a cordless vacuum cleaner for the garage. I purchased this one off Facebook secondhand and it was definitely worth it. Next was a quick lesson on how to use the riv nut tool and to install the riv nuts into the firewall. However, for the last riv nuts on either side, I couldn't get the riv nut tool into the right position, so I had to come up with a plan. I first tried to use a screw with a nut, and this didn't work as the riv nut just turned with the nut and unscrewed itself. So I worked out that holding the riv nut with a pair of pliers stopped it from turning and clamped the screw at the same time, which allowed me to tighten the nut, and in turn the riv nut compressed. As the riv nuts have a 1 to 2 mm lip, I didn't want fumes and warm air blowing into the cabin via this gap. So I thought it would be best to seal the gap with some self-adhesive neoprene foam, which I could simply stick on and trim around the riv nuts with a scalpel. This didn't work and I ended up having to remove it. So the GoPro did its thing again and corrupted the memory card. But what I ended up doing was placing the foam over the riv nuts with the backing paper still attached and pressing hard to imprint where the riv nuts were. I then used a hole punch to punch out the holes, which can be seen on the backing paper, which I've already removed. So if you recalled when we drilled out the pop rivet over here, it actually had this spacer which was between the scuttle and the dash hoop. Now, because we put the riv nut in here, it's got a bit of a lip already. So I found that the two smaller washers with the O-ring when screwed in, is the same thickness as this. So the idea of the O-ring in is I can put the screw through the scuttle, put the 2 washers on, and put the O-ring on the screw to hold it in place while I clip it over the hoop. And the reason being for that is that I'm going to have the cage on, and I'm not going to be able to lift this panel out and put this in. Also, when the scuttle hooks onto these 2 studs, I won't be able to get the 2 washers in. So the idea is that the panel will sit between the black washer and the 2 silver washers, and hopefully it'll just line up and I can screw it in like so. And I have testers, you can just screw it in, and the O-ring is quite happy to move along the thread. And you can just push it along out again. So let's put the scuttle on and see how it goes. So just to give you an idea what it looks like. So I got the screw through the scuttle with the 2 washers and the O-ring just to hold it in place. So this is just so the screw won't fall out. And I've done the same on the other side. So the one thing you need to keep in mind when doing up these 2 is you need to keep the panel in line. As the rib nuts are aluminium, I didn't want to use steel bolts as they tend to weld themselves together and you struggle to remove them. Seeing the scuttle is such a light item, I decided to use aluminium button hex screws, which look the same as the original black pop rivets. The supplier didn't have enough at the time for all the holes, so I'll have to fit some more when I get them. So another thing I wanted to point out to you, if you look inside, there's a mark that they punch, and they punch the chassis. And if you line those 2 marks up, that's how you know where about the scuttle needs to be. And there's one in each side.
So that's it for this episode. I hope you guys enjoyed watching. Please like and subscribe. And let me know if you've got any comments or questions. I do try and answer them all. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time where we take on the suspension.